Tonight I have 3 deeply unsettling stories from people who work the night shift. These were submitted online by real people who experienced something during those late quiet hours that they've never been able to explain. Lock your doors, turn the lights down, and let's get into it. I used to work overnight at a 24-hour Walgreens in a small town outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I was 19 at the time, just trying to save money before starting community college in the fall. The store was on a state highway that connected a few rural towns, so after about 11 at night, traffic basically died. Between midnight and 5 in the morning, we get maybe 2 or 3 customers total, sometimes none. It was me and one other person most nights. A woman named Darlene who was in her 50s. She mostly stayed in the back doing inventory and restocking. I ran the register, mopped the floors, and tried not to fall asleep standing up. The store had these big glass windows across the entire front. During the day that was fine. But at night, when the parking lot lights were on and the inside of the store was bright, you could see everything outside with perfect clarity. And anyone outside could see you just as easily. It was a Wednesday night in October. Around 1:30 in the morning, Darlene was in the back. I was up front wiping down the counter when I glanced through the window and noticed someone standing in the parking lot. He was about 40 yards from the entrance, just standing there, facing the store. I figured it was someone about to come in. Maybe they were on the phone or finishing a cigarette. I went back to cleaning. A few minutes later, I looked up again. He hadn't moved. Same spot, same position, hands at his sides, facing the store. That was the first time I felt something cold creep up the back of my neck. I tried to make out details, but the parking lot lights created this harsh contrast that made him look almost like a silhouette. I could tell he was wearing dark clothing, average build, maybe 5'10" or 6 feet. I couldn't see his face clearly. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe his car broke down and he was figuring out what to do. There were a dozen explanations. I walked to the back and told Darlene there was a guy standing in the parking lot. She came up front, looked out the window, and shrugged. Probably a tweaker, she said. We get them sometimes. He'll wander off. She went back to the stockroom. I stayed at the register. 10 minutes passed. He was still there. Same exact spot. I hadn't seen him move even slightly. No shifting of weight, no turning his head, nothing. He stood perfectly, unnaturally still. I started to feel genuinely unsettled. I pulled out my phone and thought about calling the non-emergency police line, but I talked myself out of it. What would I even say? There's a man standing in a public parking lot? They'd laugh at me. At around 2 in the morning, something changed. He took a step forward, just one step. Then he stopped again. My stomach dropped. I can't explain why one single step forward was so frightening, but it was. It felt deliberate, calculated, like he wanted me to notice. I watched him for another 5 minutes, barely breathing. Then he took another step, and another. He was walking toward the store, slowly, not in any hurry. Each step was measured, with a long pause between them, like he was savoring the approach. I backed away from the counter. My hands were shaking. I called out for Darlene. She came up front, saw the look on my face, and looked out the window. He was maybe 20 yards away now. Lock the doors, she said. I'd never heard Darlene sound scared before. That scared me more than anything. I ran to the front entrance and turned the deadbolt. The automatic sliding doors had a manual lock override, and I engaged it. My hands were trembling so badly I almost couldn't do it. When I turned back to the window, he had stopped again. He was close enough now that I could make out more detail. He was wearing a dark hoodie pulled up over his head. His face was in shadow, but I could tell he was looking directly at me. Not at the store, at me. Darlene was on the phone with the police. I heard her voice behind me, strained and urgent, giving them the address. He's just standing there staring at the store, she said. No, he hasn't done anything. I don't care. Send someone. I kept my eyes on him. For a long time, maybe 3 or 4 minutes, nothing happened. Then he raised one hand, slowly, and he pointed at me, not at the store, not at the window, at me specifically. His arm extended, his finger aimed right at where I was standing. I stumbled backward and knocked the display over. Darlene grabbed my arm. "Get in the back," she said. Now, we both went into the stockroom. Darlene had a box cutter in her hand. We sat in the back, listening, waiting for the police to come. It took 11 minutes according to my phone. It felt like an hour. When the officer arrived and walked the parking lot, there was no one there. He checked the perimeter of the building, checked behind the dumpsters, even drove around the block. Nothing. The man was gone. The officer told us it was probably just someone messing around, told us to call back if he returned. He didn't return that night, but 2 nights later, I was working the register again. It was almost the same time, around 1:45 in the morning. I looked up through the window. He was there. Same spot, same position, same dark hoodie. I didn't wait. I locked the doors immediately and called the police. By the time they arrived, 8 minutes later, he was gone again. This happened 3 more times over the next 2 weeks. Always on nights I was working. Always between 1 and 2 in the morning. Always in the same spot. The police never caught him. They never even saw him. The last time it happened, I was looking out the window at the empty parking lot, feeling that familiar tension in my chest, scanning for him. And then my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. It said, "You should really close those blinds." There were no blinds on those windows. There never have been. I quit that job the next day. I never went back, not even to pick up my last paycheck. I moved to a different town 3 months later for school, and I never told anyone the full story until now. I still don't know who he was. I still don't know what he wanted. But sometimes, late at night, I'll glance out my apartment window into the parking lot below, and I hold my breath until I'm sure no one is standing there. This happened when I was 23, working the front desk at a small motel in northern New Mexico. The kind of place that sits right off the interstate and caters mostly to truckers and people passing through. 32 rooms, single story, shaped like an L. I worked the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift 5 nights a week. Most of the job was just sitting behind the desk watching TV and occasionally checking someone in. We get a few late arrivals, usually around midnight, and then nothing until early morning when people started checking out. The motel was old, built in the 60s or 70s. The rooms had those heavy wooden doors with brass numbers screwed into them, and the locks were the old-fashioned kind with actual metal keys. No key cards. The owner was too cheap to upgrade. We had a room 4 that we didn't rent out. It had been out of service since before I started working there. When I asked about it during training, the manager, a guy named Paul, just said the plumbing was messed up and it wasn't worth fixing. I accepted that. I never thought about it again until one night in November. I was behind the desk, probably around 2 in the morning. The motel was about half full, maybe 14 or 15 occupied rooms. Everything was quiet. Then the phone on the desk rang. It was an internal call. The little display showed it was coming from room 4. I stared at the phone for a moment. Room 4 was empty. Room 4 was always empty. The door was locked, and as far as I knew, no one had the key except Paul. I picked up the phone. "Front desk," I said. Silence. Not dead silence. There was an open line. I could hear ambient noise, like someone was in a room with the phone off the hook. There was a faint sound in the background, almost like breathing, but not quite. More like a low, rhythmic exhale. "Hello?" I said. The sound continued for maybe 10 seconds. Then the line went dead. I put the phone down and sat there for a moment trying to rationalize it. Old wiring, a glitch in the phone system. The motel's infrastructure was ancient. Stuff like that probably happened all the time, but something about it stuck with me. That sound on the other end, it didn't sound mechanical. It sounded organic. I thought about walking over to room 4 and checking it. The room was on the short side of the L, about 60 yards from the front office, but I decided against it. The door was locked. No one could be in there. I was being paranoid. I went back to watching TV. 20 minutes later, the phone rang again. Room 4. I hesitated, then picked up. This time I heard something different. It was still quiet, still that low ambient noise, but underneath it I could hear something that sounded like whispering. Very faint, like someone was speaking from across the room, not into the phone. I couldn't make out words, but the cadence was unmistakable. Someone was talking. "Who is this?" I said. The whispering stopped. Then very clearly, a voice said, "Can you come to the room, please?" It was a man's voice, calm, polite even. But something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. There was no emotion in it, no inflection. It was like someone reading a line from a script. "Room 4 is out of service," I said. "No one should be in that room?" A pause. "Can you come to the room, please?" He said again. Exact same words, exact same tone. Like a recording being played back. I hung up. My heart was beating fast now. I picked up my cell phone and called Paul. It went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. It was 2:30 in the morning. He was asleep and wasn't going to answer. I sat behind the desk and stared at the phone, willing it not to ring. It rang. Room 4. I didn't pick up this time. I let it ring. It rang 6 times, then stopped. A minute of silence. Then it rang again. Room 4. 6 rings. Stopped. Again. Room 4. 6 rings. Stopped. This continued for almost 15 minutes. Every minute or so, the phone would ring from room 4. 6 rings each time. I never picked up. Then it stopped completely. I sat in the quiet for a long time, barely breathing, watching the phone. Nothing happened. At around 3:15, I decided I needed to go look. I couldn't just sit there all night wondering. I grabbed the flashlight we kept behind the desk and walked outside. The air was cold and dry. The parking lot was lit by a few yellowish overhead lights that barely covered half the lot. The motel stretched out to my right, doors facing the parking area. I walked along the sidewalk, past room 1, room 2, room 3. I stopped in front of room 4. The door was closed. It looked the same as always, old wood. Brass number 4, a faded "Do Not Disturb" sign hanging from a handle that had been there as long as I could remember. I pressed my ear to the door. Silence. I knocked. "Hello? Front desk. Is someone in there?" Nothing. I stood there for a moment, then tried the handle. Locked. Like it always was. I shined the flashlight at the window. The curtain was drawn, but there was a tiny gap at the edge. I leaned in close and tried to see through it. The room was dark. I could make out vague shapes. The bed, a knit stand, the outline of a TV on a dresser. Nothing unusual. Then something moved. It was fast. A shape shifting in the darkness at the far end of the room, near the bathroom. Just a flicker of movement, barely there and then gone. I jerked back from the window. I stood on the sidewalk, flashlight in hand, heart hammering. I didn't go back to that window. I walked straight back to the front office, locked the door behind me, and sat behind the desk until my shift ended at 7. When Paul came in that morning, I told him everything. He listened without expression. When I was done, he said, "The phone system's old. It glitches. Someone was talking, Paul. Someone asked me to come to the room." He looked at me for a long moment. "Don't answer calls from room 4, he said. That was it. That was all he said. He didn't offer to go check the room. He didn't seem surprised or concerned. He just told me not to answer. I worked there for another 3 months before I found a different job. During that time, room 4 called the front desk 4 more times. I never answered. But one night, during my last week, I was walking past room 4 on my way to check a breaker on the far side of the building. As I passed the door, I heard something that stopped me cold. From inside the room, muffled but unmistakable, I heard knocking. not on the door from the inside. Rhythmic, deliberate knocking like someone knocking on the inside of a wall. 3 slow knocks, a pause. 3 more. I kept walking and didn't look back. I never found out who or what was in room 4. I asked Paul about it one more time before I left, and he told me some rooms just need to stay closed. That's a strange thing to say about a plumbing problem. I need to preface this by saying I'm not someone who scares easily. I grew up in rural Montana. I've been hiking and camping since I was old enough to walk. I've encountered bears, mountain lions, and severe weather in the backcountry. None of that ever made me feel the kind of fear I felt during this experience. This happened in September of 2021. I was 27. I had just gone through a rough breakup and decided to take a solo trip to clear my head. I drove out to a national forest in northern Idaho. I'm not going to name which one, and planned to do a 3-day backpacking loop on a trail I'd done once before, about 4 years earlier. The trailhead was at the end of a gravel forest road, about 45 minutes from the nearest town. When I arrived on a Tuesday morning, there was one other vehicle in the small dirt lot, a white pickup truck. I figured another hiker was somewhere on the trail ahead of me. The first day was uneventful, beautiful weather. I hiked about 9 miles to a designated backcountry campsite near a creek. I set up my tent, cooked dinner, and watched the sun go down through the trees. It was exactly what I needed. The second day is when things got strange. I broke camp early, around 7 a.m., and started hiking toward my next campsite, another 8 miles up the trail. The forest was dense tall pines, thick underbrush. The trail was narrow and winding, and visibility was limited to maybe 30 or 40 feet in any direction. Around mid-morning, I came around a bend and saw someone on the trail ahead of me. It was a woman. She was standing about 50 yards ahead on the trail, facing my direction. My first thought was that she was the owner of the white pickup, another solo hiker. I raised my hand to wave. She didn't wave back. She just stood there. I kept walking toward her, figuring she was just taking a break or looking at a map. As I got closer, maybe 30 yards away, I started to notice details that made me slow down. She was wearing a long-sleeve flannel shirt and jeans. Not hiking clothes. No backpack. No water bottle. No gear of any kind. She was wearing what looked like regular shoes, not boots, not trail runners. Just plain flat shoes. Her hair was long and dark, hanging loose around her face. She wasn't moving at all. Not shifting her weight, not looking around. Just standing perfectly still, facing me. I stopped walking. "Hey," I called out. "You okay?" No response. "Are you lost? Do you need help?" Nothing. We stood there, maybe 25 yards apart, in total silence. The forest around us was quiet, no birds, no wind, just dead, heavy silence. Something in my gut told me to stop. Every instinct I had, honed by years of being in the wilderness, told me that something was deeply wrong with this situation. I looked at her more carefully. Her posture was strange. She was standing slightly tilted, like her weight was unevenly distributed. Her arms hung at her sides at slightly different angles. And her face, I couldn't see it clearly from that distance, but it looked blank. Not scared, not angry, not anything. Just vacant. "Ma'am," I said, "can you hear me?" She tilted her head, just slightly to one side, like a dog hearing a strange noise. That was it for me. I don't care if she was having a medical emergency or a mental health crisis or whatever. Every part of my brain was screaming at me to leave. I've read enough about people being used as lures in the wilderness to know that when something feels wrong, you trust that feeling. I stepped off the trail to the right, planning to give her a wide berth and continue past her. I moved through the underbrush, keeping about 50 feet between us. As I moved, her head turned to follow me. Her body didn't move. Her feet stayed planted, but her head tracked me as I walked. I kept going, pushing through bush and stepping over fallen logs, my eyes on her the entire time. When I was roughly parallel to her, she took a step toward me. I froze. She stopped. We stared at each other. Then she smiled. It was the worst smile I've ever seen. Too wide, too sudden, like someone who had seen a smile described but never actually performed one. It didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes stayed completely flat and empty. I turned and walked faster. I didn't run. I didn't want to trigger whatever instinct would make her chase me, but I moved with purpose. I bushwhacked through the forest for about 100 yards before cutting back to the trail. When I got back on the trail, I looked behind me. She was there, on the trail, maybe 60 yards back, standing still again. She had moved. She had followed me somehow, silently through the forest, and was now behind me on the trail, standing in the same motionless posture as before. Now I ran. I ran for at least a mile. Full pack, 35 pounds on my back, crashing down the trail as fast as I could. I tripped once and caught myself on my hands, scraping my palms on gravel, but I didn't stop. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I was doubled over, gasping. I looked back down the trail, empty. I didn't see her again for the rest of the day, but I changed my plans. I was supposed to camp at a site along the lake that night, but instead I kept hiking. I pushed through the rest of the loop in one brutal push 17 miles total that day. I hiked until it was dark, using my headlamp for the last 2 hours, something I never normally do on an unfamiliar trail. I got back to the trailhead at around 9 p.m. My legs were destroyed. My feet were blistered. I didn't care. The parking lot was empty except for my car. The white pickup was gone. I drove straight to town and checked into the first motel I could find. I sat on the bed and tried to process what had happened. I told myself there was probably a simple explanation. Maybe she was a local with mental health issues who wandered onto the trail. Maybe she was on drugs. Maybe she was just eccentric and I overreacted. But there's one detail I haven't mentioned yet. One detail that I keep coming back to, that I can't explain, and that still makes me feel sick when I think about it. When I ran past her position on the trail, that moment when I looked back and saw her standing, 60 yards behind me, I noticed something I hadn't before. She wasn't wearing shoes. Earlier, when I first saw her from a distance, I thought she was wearing flat shoes. But when I saw her from closer, in that brief glance before I turned and ran, her feet were bare. She was standing barefoot on a rocky mountain trail in northern Idaho, and there wasn't a mark on her feet. No dirt, no scratches. Her feet were clean and pale, like she just stepped out of a bathtub. I've been back in the woods many times since then. I hike regularly. I camp alone, but I don't hike in northern Idaho anymore. And when I'm on a trail and I see someone ahead of me standing still, my hand goes to the bear spray on my chest strap, and I don't take it off until I pass them and they're well out of sight. Some people don't belong in the woods, and some things in the woods don't belong anywhere. Those were 3 true stories from people who experienced something during the quiet hours that they've never been able to fully explain. If you have your own story you'd like to share, you can send it to me. And if you're watching this alone right now, late at night, maybe don't look out the window. Let me know in the comments which story disturbed you the most. I'll see you in the next one.